he's an emblematic figure of 20th century consciousness, Merton. He exemplifies a burgeoning awareness, partly abetted by the phenomenological movement, of modernity's failure to fully account for the real needs of the human condition. In doing so, Merton represents a cultural watershed that commenced when mid-century Europeans began to seek in Asian thought what was lost to the West. This presentation will offer a phenomenologically informed reading of Merton in his dialogue with Asian thought, particularly focusing on Zen and the Birds of Appetite and his Asian journals, both written at the very end of his life. So I'm looking at them as kind of culminating statements. You're going to see that there's indirect phenomenological influence. I'm going to pull what I can. But basically, we're going to be talking about his project to graft the living contemplative traditions of Asia into the revitalization and renewal of Western monasticism. And it'll be shown that his particular attention to commonalities between Catholic and Buddhist monasticism points the way to an expanded comparative phenomenology of contemplative practice. Okay? Time permitting, we'll follow how Merton's contemplative practice diverged from the project of scientific academic phenomenology, in that contemplation for him is directed towards personal self-cultivation. That'll be my watchword, self-cultivation and scientific phenomenology. And that's kind of the difference, and we'll explore that. And what comes with self-cultivation, however, is, unlike scientific phenomenology, is enhanced relations with others in the pragmatic real world, in the lived world of everyday life. And we'll conclude with, hopefully, a discussion of this ambivalence. So first I want to talk about the idea of East and West, Eastern religion and Western religion. And then I want to talk about the commonalities and the differences, particularly through the concepts of Nirodha in Indian thought, which is the key contemplative term, and epoche in phenomenology, which is our key contemplative term. So we're talking about Asian and European spiritual and scientific traditions. And it's first very important to point out that the concept of East and West is a bit made up, is a bit fabricated. I think it's a cultural layover from the colonial era. And I'm coming from a position here where there's research done by this guy named Thomas McEvilley, which nobody knows about, and I want to speak about him. So there's much more cultural diffusion between India and the classical Mediterranean world than most scholarship has previously acknowledged. McEvilley's research, based on physical archaeological evidence, we're not talking hippie conjecture, okay, Jesus lived in India. This is physical archaeological evidence. He makes a case for how mainstream Vedantism and Buddhism were very likely influenced by the idealism of Plato and Aristotle. It's acknowledged by most archaeologists, actually, that there was a vigorous trade in luxury goods between India and post-Alexandrian Hellenic kingdoms in the later Roman Empire. And in fact, people don't realize that there were fusion Greco-Buddhist kingdoms in Bactria, which is now modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, where all the fighting's going on. And these kingdoms, which went on for almost 400 years, they were literally Greco-Indian Buddhist fusion kingdoms, remarkable. And the art is stunning, if you see it. McEvilley is an art historian. He shows that, on the other hand, there was also a diffusion of tantric Indian yoga and Buddhism and certain Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Orphic, Dionysian, Greek spiritualities, that there was a commonality in these spiritual structures. Perhaps even influencing medieval Christendom, Jewish Kabbalism, and Islamic Sufism. So there's a strain here, there's a pattern that he picks up in his archaeological research and in the research of other archaeologists. And I think we have to pay attention to that. It's important. There's evidence. Be it as it may, even Elaine Pagels, in her famous commentary on the introduction to the Gnostic Gospels, can't but comment on the rich implications of Christianity's commingled roots with Asian thought, specifically Buddhism. And she also comments on how this is underplayed, and it is in the 20th century contemplative spirit of Merton that this breach first begins to get seriously addressed on a deeper level. So first, phenomenology and Asian thought. You all know, many of us are trained in philosophy, you all know what Hegel did to that discourse. He started the pattern in European thought of talking about Asian thought as if it was childlike, and in a certain sense condescendingly belittles Asian thought, and he established a tradition of seeing Asian thought as primitive. Of course, there were no good translations, there's not a lot of travel going on, and the contact we did have with Asians was usually when we were in a position of military dominance. So we don't need to review what Orientalism means. We all know what that is, a la Edward Said. So while much may be made at this conference about the mutualities between phenomenology and South Asian mindfulness traditions, the constraints bear mentioning too. Firstly, Husserl reveals at the beginning of his career, most of his career, an attitude of conventional condescension that reflects the high noon of the colonial era 100 years ago. In The Crisis, he was famously chauvinistic in the way in which he writes off the East, or Asian thought. Then, however, something happens. Someone gives him a translation that was done by a man named Carl Newman of various Buddhist texts. And so I'm going to shamelessly read a whole page to you. I just think I would never do this, but at this conference I think it's appropriate to read a whole page of what Husserl says about his discovery of Buddhist thought at the very end of his life, after he's already given the lectures for The Crisis. He says this, quote, I have now read the greatest portion of Carl Eugen Newman's German translation of the main parts of the Holy Scriptures of Buddhism. Once I had begun reading, I could not rid myself of it, even though I still had other more urgent work to do. In fact, we all know that feeling. In fact, this has also brought an additional marvelous treasure to literature translated into German. Though the organization of this new edition, which from every point of view is exemplary and of the highest taste, it is the immortal life of K.E. Newman, the publisher, has rendered an exceptional service. With these translations, this highest flower of Indian religiosity, whose vision and practical effort are purely directed inwards, which I would say is not transcendent, but transcendental, which for Husserl is a compliment, will enter the horizon of our religious, ethical, as well as philosophical consciousness, and from now on will, without doubt, take up the vocation of the effective co-determination of this consciousness. This perfect linguistic recreation of the canonical Buddhist scriptures provides us with the perfect possibility, in a way completely opposite to our European one, to see and know the world and to take a stand with regard to it, to become überwindend in an ethical, religious way, to understand it generally through the lived through experience of the world itself, and out of this understanding to experience its living effectiveness. For us, for everyone who in this time of the collapse of our superficial and denigrated culture looks around with enthusiasm to search for spiritual purity and authenticity, as well as the peaceful overcoming of the world, this coming into visibility of the Indian way of overcoming the world is a great experience. For any devoted reader, it should very soon be clear that Buddhism, as it speaks to us out of its pure original source, is about an ethical religious method of spiritual purification and pacification of the highest dignity. This method is thought through and practiced with an almost incomparable internal coherence, energy, and nobility of mind. Buddhism can only be paralleled with the highest formations of the philosophical and religious spirit of our European culture. From now on, it is our destiny to contrast the Indian spiritual way, which is entirely new to us, with our old way, and by virtue of this contrast, to revitalize and to strengthen our own. I'm sorry, I just had to read that. It's just, wow. Moreover, with regard to his own newly adopted Christian tradition, Husserl converted to Christianity. We don't know anything about that. We need to know more about what was that about. Lutheranism, and he was a really devout practitioner. He says, quote, "It will awaken new forces of religious intuition. Hence, it will also contribute to the vivification and deepening of Christian intuition, and thus be beneficial to our ability to understand Christian religiosity in a true and internal way." So he's on to this project of renewing what Christianity means. It's amazing. So unaware of Husserl's last-minute discovery of Buddhism, later in the early 60s, Merleau-Ponty carries on the typically Eurocentric perspective, of all people, Merleau-Ponty. And he writes, perhaps condescendingly, of the Orient's childishness, quote unquote, though he says it does have something to offer us. Okay? That's it. And in the same way that he sees the Orient in the same way that he values the pre-reflective state of childhood experience as a natural condition of the phenomenological epoche and a precondition of for intersubjectivity and empathy. But it's a mixed appraisal. To compare it to childish consciousness is a little problematic. And it's, of all people, Merleau-Ponty was respectful of other cultures, but he wasn't on the program of, he didn't really know about Asian thought, which is stunning because of the commonality of his thinking. In fact, it kind of verifies, it validifies his thought that it was, despite his condescending cultural attitude towards Asian thought, he's still nonetheless speaking what they're speaking, the same truths. Okay, so enough said about Orientalisms, but it's really clear that Husserl realized at the end of his life he missed the boat. Okay, and but it's up for us to take it up. So now I want to talk about the similarities and commonalities, and then we'll talk about. Then I'll conclude with Merton. So I want to start with Nirodha. And also understand that ahead I'm going to use the word yoga and mindfulness a bit synonymously for a reason I hope become clear. You have to understand that Samkhya is like the first really established Indian school of thought. And what we call yoga is kind of vague, but we do know that Samkhya, yoga, and Buddhism, there's a continuity in these schools. So there's differences, but what holds them all together is this notion of Nirodha. It's really important. So the meaning of the word yoga is the actual application of mindfulness. Yoga means practice. It means doing it. It's concrete. And the Samkhya Yoga Buddhist tradition's comprehensive definition of yoga, namely the suspension of the whirlpools of the mind, such that the true seer may come forth and see the world as it actually is. This comes from Patanjali. And Patanjali uses the word Nirodha, comes from Samkhya, and in turn the Buddhists are using Nirodha. So it's not Patanjali, we don't know when he wrote, but he was certainly influenced by the Buddhists, and as well as the Samkhya school. And Nirodha is the concept that everyone's using. It varies a little bit, but for the most part it means the same thing. And what it means is, to put into abeyance, to suspend, to abstain, to hold back, to step back. And, you know, I've searched all the translations of, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but I've looked at all the translations, every one, and I've looked at the etymology, and the word is stunningly similar to epoche. It's just ridiculous. You can't say it enough. So, by applying the meditation term of Nirodha, and that bears to mention the full translation is Yogaha Chitta Vritti Nirodha means suspension. Yoga is the suspension of the whirlpools of the mind, such that the true seer may come forth and see the world as it actually is. So by practicing Nirodha, okay, you're clearing your senses or your consciousness, and by doing that, the true seer, the seer, Druha, comes forth, and then the world gets clear. So the seer, we're talking noetic and nomadic structures here. The Buddhist traditions use the same, I guess I've really said that. Now, the Buddhist traditions use the same Samkhya-based term Nirodha but they also apply the term smrti to emphasize the perpetual, and you guys are going to talk about that a bit, to emphasize the perpetual vigilance to remember. It's usually translated as remembering, or I prefer to say it's about catching oneself, drifting from the dehiscence of the living body through the vehicle of the breath focus. So really, smrti means catching, watching, catching oneself, because you can never really fully occupy the present moment, and they're on to that. But you can best catch yourself and come as close as possible to the margin of the living present moment, of the dehiscence of the sensory body. So in this way, mindfulness more literally would be rendered mindlessness, but that doesn't work well in English or in most languages. This is also the issue with translations with such terms as emptiness, void, and nothingness. Subtlety doesn't translate well, and echoing Meister Eckhart, it's more nameless than with a name, more unknown than known. Now, it's also really important, I'm going to summarize. There's a scholar named Ian Witcher, a good Sanskrit scholar, and he's made a very important point about nirodha, which is often gets translated as stopping the mind, and he says that's a violence. That's really a mischaracterization. It's really about abeyance. It's about holding back, never stopping. And he says that's done a great disservice to meditators. And he really makes that argument very clear. So now epoche. Now correspondingly, Husserl, in a radically different cultural context, differentiates phenomenology from British empiricism's restriction of knowledge to sense experiences alone, as well as from the unreflectively assumed ontology of naturalistic material. I don't need to go on to this about all of you. But he calls for the return to the things themselves, the world that gives itself to pre-reflective experience without judgments or metaphysical presuppositions about the reality, character of objects in the world. He resurrects a meditation term, or what I prefer, a self-cultivation practice, or technique or procedure. He takes this term from the Greco-Roman Stoic tradition called the epoche. And it's really important to draw attention to the Stoic tradition from which he takes the word. Okay? He resurrects this, and this is a central feature of his practice, as rigorous science. So in Husserl's word, it's an inhibiting, quote-unquote, putting out of play of all the positions taken toward the direct, already given objective world. He also calls this methodological a parenthesizing of the objective world. And also, Husserl's always thinking like a mathematician. He's thinking literally parenthesizing. But he's taken it from a meditation tradition, an ancient meditation tradition, which is the Stoical one. Nathan Sidden is the one who really helpfully emphasizes the word in his commentary, abeyance, for understanding what epoche means. He says over and again, it's abeyance. And I think he says that's the perfect English word for epoche, and I think he's spot on. Okay, again, it's recognizing the natural attitude, detaching oneself from normal consciousness, not taking for granted assumed beliefs or doubts regarding the ontological status of anything. The emphasis here is on exploration. This is the difference with nirodha. It's on exploration of a newly reactivated, reanimated life world, a return to things themselves. So while Asians were about the cultivation of lifestyles or habits to liberate oneself from the suffering inherent to the human condition, phenomenology, as rigorous science, is about exploration of the world through the description that happens from within the contemplative, denaturalized perspective of the epoche. Again, description, not as much about self-cultivation. Yes, we explore nomadic dynamics, the circularity of constitution, but yet this is a matter of emphasis and weight. The weight seems to be on exploring the world, not on self-cultivation. So ask ourselves, do we discuss ethical self-cultivation practices to enhance our capacity to practice phenomenology? This is the question. Gary Madison, however, is the one phenomenologist I know who has actually taken up the issue of phenomenological method as an ethical practice. And it's a really lovely article, and he explores the roots of the word epoche in the Stoic tradition. He lays out how the Stoic tradition, It's not compatible with phenomenology in lots of respects, but the method of the epoche is compatible. And he lays out what a self-cultivation ethical practice might be as a phenomenologist, and he concludes, quote unquote, when they are brought together and made to interact, Stoicism is purified of its naturalistic trappings by means of the phenomenological reduction, while phenomenology, by absorbing the Stoic ethics of virtue, is made into a genuinely practical philosophy, a philosophy one can actually live by. We don't talk about that. Do you live by phenomenological ethics? We don't talk that way. You know, and Madison's saying, why not? The Stoics did with this method. The Buddhists did with their method. This is not only do we have something to learn from the Stoics, but we've got a hell of a lot to learn from the Buddhists about how to live ethically, which we don't do as phenomenologists. We kind of keep it academic and in classrooms and papers and books, but not about concrete lives. Maybe in psychology we get closer to that, you know, in psychology. So this is not exactly the same as the South Asian contemplative traditions, but yet stunningly similar in light of the innovations of culture and history. Still, by and large, history's project is a scientific one, not a project of personal self-cultivation. So, one is fully engaged for Husserl in modernity's project of science, albeit one that is more than empiricist. The other, the Buddhist tradition, like Stoicism, is more on the perennial emphasis of self-cultivation, as in the case of in Christianity, however, which is even more towards personal salvation. So enter Merton. I'll just make some quick, try to move quick here. Enter Merton. So who's Merton? We'll give you the whole biography. It's a fascinating story. He grew up in France, an American, grew up in France. He's completely francophone. He's a Catholic monastic francophone, American. And we know of his voracious readings across the contemporary 20th century French scene. He was certainly familiar with Gabriel Marcel's existential apologetics for Catholicism. And he converts, he's a Marxist in his youth, and then he converts to Catholicism and wants to become a Trappist monk. So he grows up in a very secular world. His father and mother were artists, were painters, kind of a jet-setting world, and he makes his radical transformation. His early career, it's Seven Story Mountain, his first book, it's kind of typical Catholicism. It's very inspired, it's enthusiastic, but it's a lot of God talk, if you know what I mean by that. It kind of is, it's not very radically different from conventional Catholicism. But he's a writer, and apparently in the monastery, his what he called leader in the monastery, his abbot, allowed him to write. Didn't allow him to travel, but he allowed him to write. Only at the end of his life did his abbot died, the new abbot came in and let him loose. And he got to travel, and he died in Asia. Sad story. But he was able to write, and he wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote. You could see his personality blossoming as he writes. And he's writing as a Trappist monk who's also fully aware of 20th century thought and fully engaged with the political controversies of America in mid-20th century. Amazing perspective that he gives. And you see him develop into this other kind of person. And this is why I think it's important to study Merton. He's emblematic of the change that happened. So, Merton has no interest in phenomenology per se. His project is to salvage and resuscitate a Catholic monastic tradition which he feels is decaying under the pressure of modernity. His vision is to reanimate it by, as I said earlier, by grafting it intact to the living monastic traditions of Asia. As yet, less influenced by modernity, these living traditions have not yet succumbed to the mechanization and naturalization of industrialized cultures and the materialistic presuppositions of modern life. Across his writings, we see his deep admiration for Buddhist practices as indisputable. What is more amazing is his never-wavering faith in his Catholic, Christ and God-oriented theological tradition. It never wavers. But theology, at the same time, was never his focus. As a monk, his focus is practice. Practice is what moves him. And by practice, it is always the term experience that is the watchword for Merton. in discussing Zen, particularly in his real interest. He spent most of his time studying Zen. He says, quote, Buddhist meditation, but above all that of Zen, seeks not to explain but to pay attention to become aware to become mindful. In other words, to develop a certain kind of consciousness that is above and beyond description by verbal formulas, by emotion or by emotional excitement. And then he says, also, you get a feeling, a flavor for how he thinks. He says, this obsession with doctrinal formulas, juridical order, and ritual exactitude has often made people forget that at the heart of Catholicism, too, is living experience, his emphasis. The living experience of the unity of Christ, which far transcends all conceptual formulations. Similarly, he writes of St. Teresa. He says, quote, what others believed, she experienced. He also uses the term ground of openness or ontological openness as a synonym for this living experience. He is, like Husserl, always drawing us back to the foundation of directly lived, pre-intellectualized, pure experience. So we can see that Merton was influenced by phenomenology, but we can't say how much so, or in what exact ways, but we do know that he's thinking like a phenomenologist in the ground on pure experience and the method for getting there. He goes deeper into Asian thought later in his life, and he evokes phenomenology as a cross-cultural bridge. He actually invokes phenomenology. And he says, if you want to understand Asia, learn phenomenology first, and then you can understand Asia. He says that in the Zen and the Birds of Appetite. It's quite clear. Quote unquote, he says, some knowledge of existentialist phenomenology may serve as preparation for understanding, for example, the work of the Japanese Zen philosopher Kitaro Nishida, which he spent a lot of time studying Nishida. And by the way, comparative themes are taken up more recently by Kazashi Nubo, who studied this relationship between Merleau-Ponty and Nishida in detail in various publications. We happen to have Kazashi right here at our table. Thank you. Merton reveals here that to him, European phenomenology was a mediating vehicle or bridge for cross-cultural studies. So he's on to us. He would want to be at this conference, Merton. He would certainly endorse everything that we're about. And about Nishida, he writes, quote unquote, like Merleau-Ponty, Nishida is concerned with the primary structures of consciousness and seeks to preserve the unity that exists between the consciousness of the world reflected in it. The starting point for Nishida is pure experience, a direct experience of undifferentiated unity, which is quite the opposite of the starting point of Descartes and his Cogito, which I don't think gets Descartes right, but that's another thing. Okay. So there he is, quote unquote. In the Asian journals that chronicle his first trip to Asia, where he was finally let loose by his new abbot, where he also died, Merton reveals a mind at play with all Asian thought. He's reading everything he can get his hand on in translation. Okay? We're talking Tibetan Tantrism, Vipassana, Zen, Vedanta, so on. He's reading everything. And there's a near promiscuity to his appetite for this knowledge. Yet he's not a dilettante in the sense that he's a very clearly determined monastic. That's the theme that unites everything, is how to revitalize this Western tradition. Yet he remains a Catholic. Again, I keep saying he remains a Catholic to the very end. It's quite shocking. He doesn't convert to anything. And his last journal that he ever wrote documented his preparation for giving a Mass. And he also, a couple days earlier, talks about how he compares the Mass to a Japanese tea ceremony. He identifies the role of the modern monastic to that of hippies and beatniks in their common spirit of counterculture. He saw the monk as a countercultural. He even demonstrates a remarkably non-judgmental but intelligently measured attitude toward the countercultural use of hallucinogenic drugs to achieve heightened states of consciousness. Remarkable. He affirms the intention for this knowledge, but cautions about the means. Very intelligent. Whereas in the Middle Ages, monks embodied the cultural norms and ideals of their society, the role of the modern monk, Merton says, is to stand apart as exemplars of another, more positive way of life, a way of being that is also ambiguously within society, and yet also outside of society. He wants the modern monk to be educated in contemporary science and intellectual movements of the time, engaged but apart. Critically, and this is really important about Merton, is that the cause of social justice and political activism was something he felt monks must engage in. And Merton was a powerful voice against the Vietnam War, nuclear proliferation, and American racial attitudes. Paradoxically, Merton's quest to revitalize and make relevant once again the Catholic monastic tradition took life in Buddhism itself. It's no secret that Thich Nhat Hanh, his own revitalized, engaged Buddhism, was in no small way influenced by the younger Buddhist monk's relationship with the older Merton. It's amazing. He revitalized Buddhism, because the West has always emphasized social justice, and Asia didn't do so much of that. It more or less was about salvation. And Merton, and we don't know about the Thich Nhat Hanh-Merton relationship, but something happened there. And Thich Nhat Hanh very successfully transformed Buddhism, making it socially relevant. Really important. I'm coming to an end here. But he never identifies as a Buddhist, and in the end he differentiates Buddhism from Catholicism thusly. Quote, Buddhism seems to, and it's important to look at the difference because you learn a lot. Buddhism seems to take emptiness as a complete negation of all personality, whereas Christianity finds in purity of heart and unity of spirit a supreme and transcendent fulfillment of personality. And this is what attracts Merton to Nishida's seeming proximity. Quote, writing on Nishida, he says, the individual self must cease to assert himself as a center of unification and consciousness. God, capital G, himself, capital H, God himself, the personal God, is the deepest center, his emphasis, deepest center of consciousness and unification. And he says, remember the use of this term from St. John of the Cross. He refers to St. John. To fully realize this, he goes on, not by quietistic annihilation and immersion, but by active and creative awareness of love is our highest good. So I'm not sure if he's understanding Buddhism correctly. I'm not sure if Buddhism always talks about the annihilation. So which Buddhism are you talking about here? But it's certainly with Nishida, he finds someone he feels really very friendly with, very simpatico. And he talks about love as the personality of God, which is the truest center and the highest good, ethical good. And that's what practice is about for Merton as a Christian. And of course, if you know anything about Tibetan Buddhism, it's compassion and love. I think there's this great synonymous meaning here. So, did Merton find this center in his Asian quest? Let me end with this question. Did he find it? Let's let him speak. Towards the end of his first and last act of his Asian pilgrimage, and only 4 days before his tragic accidental death, Merton describes an epiphany on the site of the giant Buddhist stone statues of Pulunawara in Sri Lanka. A real epiphany. It's really rare in his writing to hear something like this. He writes, quote, looking at these figures, I was suddenly, almost forcibly jerked clean out of the habitual half-tide vision of things. We would call the natural attitude. Jerked clean out of a habitual half-tide vision of things, and an inner clearness, clarity, as if exploding from the rocks themselves, became evident and obvious. The queer evidence, his emphasis, of the reclining figure, the smile, the sad smile of Ananda standing with arms folded, much more imperative than Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, becomes straightforward and simple. The thing about this is that there is no puzzle, no problem, and really no mystery. All problems are resolved, and everything is clear simply because what matters is clear. The rock, all matter, all life is charged with Dharmakaya. Everything is emptiness, and everything is compassion. And he writes, I don't know when in my life I have ever had such a sense of beauty and spiritual validity running together in one aesthetic illumination. Dharmakaya means a lot of things in Buddhism. One of those words, you can't touch it. It has so polysemantic. But it's conventionally translated as truth body, body of truth. So it has many meanings. But one can't resist to speculate if he was putting this together with the words chanted daily by every Catholic, the body of Christ. So again, did he find his center? I think so. That's it.